an additional thing. You can not having countercyclical fiscal rule by adopting this combination will not help you if you have this type of big shocks that you that you normally face. So what what the policy debate was about that, how to address this type of shock. And the idea is that basically there is an instrument within the fiscal rules that you can use to do that. That is the escape clause. In the first generation of fiscal rules and in the second generation of fiscal rules, the escape clauses were not an important part of the rule. With this third generation and the type of shocks that we are living now, COVID, pandemics, or big shocks, now we know that escape clauses are very important. And the design of escape clauses is critical to give you the flexibility that you need to face this type of shocks. So basically, as I mentioned before, to be resilient to these shocks, you need to maintain flexibility. And this is what I was telling is the third generation of fiscal rules, how to preserve flexibility. How you, if you are the Minister of Finance of a country that faces this type of shocks, these natural disaster shocks that are not too frequent as output fluctuations, that are bigger than normal output fluctuations, what you do when you need to, on one side, you don't want to abandon your fiscal rule. You want to keep your fiscal rule, but at the same time, you need to finance additional expenditures or extraordinary expenditures that you don't have. So if you have good fiscal escape clauses, this can give you this flexibility. You don't need to drop your fiscal rule. You can just use wisely your escape clause to do that. Imagine that for me, a escape clause is like a protocol that you have in flights. You have a flight that is facing a storm. So the pilot can say, okay, I need to do a different. I cannot do the same because we are facing a storm. I will apply my escape clause. My escape clause is the protocol in situations in which you are in problems. This is what I say. The escape clause provides you predictability in unpredictable scenarios. To navigate this plane that is facing the storm, you need a protocol. You need to say, okay, this is a extraordinary condition, but I will do A, B, C, D to navigate this storm. So this is what is important in escape clause. And basically, what escape clause can give you need to be very, very well defined. And this is what we were doing in several countries. Try to convince governments that an important part of your fiscal rule that is always forgiven is the escape clause. But this escape clause needs to have several characteristics to be an effective tool to give you the flexibility and to maintain your credibility. And the first is that normally the countries that have escape clauses, they have very vague, very general escape clauses. You need to be very specific on what are the type of shocks that will enable the use of the escape clause. This is the first and important lessons on how to design an escape clause. The events that will trigger the application of the escape clause needs to be very well specified. You cannot say every shock that you have, you will use the escape clause. Or if you don't define what type of shocks will trigger that, you can use any shocks or any event as a way to forbid to drop the rule for a time. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to give all this policy space to for discretion. You need to define very well what are the type of shocks that will trigger the use of the rule. More important, you need to also specify the exact magnitude of the shock. You cannot see that a small fluctuation or a small natural disaster can trigger your rule. You need to have in your escape clause a very precise characterization of the type of the magnitude of the shock that will enable you to invoke the escape clause. That is very, very important. Say this type of shocks, more than 3% of GDP, fall of my revenues or the economy of 5% of GDP will trigger that. The other thing is that is very important is the size of the deviation. In COVID, it happens a lot that many can say, okay, we are in COVID, we will use escape clause, but the escape clause didn't specify it, how much you will deviate from your fiscal rule. how much will be the size of your response package. Some countries did 15% of GDP, others did 5, etc. And the countries that did the largest deviation from the fiscal rules are now in problems with high debt, etc. So the third characteristic, the important characteristic of escape clause is the definition of the size of the deviation that you are allowed to get if you are in this extraordinary event. And finally, the fourth important characteristic is that it needs also to specify how you will return to your debt rules, how many years you have to come back to your rule, to resume the adoption of the rule. And this is other thing that in most of the escape clauses that we analyze it, they don't specify how many years, what will be the rate, the pace of returning to your rule. But the idea is to say, okay, in 3 years you will come back to your rule, yeah, and every year you will do a third or a fourth part of this deviation. I will get in the 4th year 100% with my rule. So that is these 4 things will help you to keep your credibility, but at the same time give you the flexibility that you need. Now going to the third part of my presentation is only to see how practical lessons of that. And basically, as I mentioned before, after the 90s, you have the expansion of fiscal rules. Many countries adopted fiscal rules. Before the 90s, you have less than 5 countries adopting fiscal rules. Now you have more than 110 countries adopting that. And LAC followed the same trend. After, in the second part of the 90s, several countries in LAC decided to adopt fiscal rules and were adopting, and also small countries, Caribbean countries, were doing the same. The first fiscal rule in Latin America was the one that was adopted by the 6 countries of the OECs. Basically, that was a rule linked to the monetary union. Then a second characteristic of fiscal rules is not only that they are using increasingly, but also the type of rules that we're using at the beginning were, as I mentioned before, debt rules or balance rule. But now we have a lot of expenditure rules that came in the last years. Everybody noted that this positive characteristic of an expenditure rule combined with a debt rule that gives you some counter-cyclicality is very important. So expenditure rules were increasing. And this also happened in LAC. If you see the number of expenditure rules that Latin American countries have, both small and large LAC economies, is increasing, as you see in the graph in the bottom of the slide. Then the second question that you have, okay, it's good to have fiscal rules.
Sorry, Fernando, sorry to interrupt you. Just to flag you that you're running out of time in your presentation, and maybe you could wrap up, and then we can take compliance in the discussion as we go on. Thank you, Fernando. We really want to have that discussion. Over.
Okay, just 1 minute to conclude. As I mentioned it before, it's not having rules doesn't mean that you comply with your rules. So we did some calculation on the compliance of the rules, and we noted that after COVID, everybody dropped the rules basically. And you have a report on a nice report of the IMF showing how COVID affected the use of fiscal rules. So and again demonstrated the need for flexibility. And my last my last minutes I will spend on what are the factors that affect the compliance of fiscal rules. And it's important because you need to have a strong overall fiscal framework. It's not only the rule that will work. You need to have good systems of public finance management, good accounting system, etc. It's a package. It's not just the rule. Several countries adopt the rule, but is in a vacuum without all this structure. So I think that is important, and this is my last message, is that you need to take a look to your institutions and try to improve them, because the rule will not do miracles if you don't have all the other elements that we were mentioning. And thank you very much, and apologize for the excess of time that I took.
No worries. Thank you so much, Fernando. I think that was very interesting, gave lots of food for thought. You can stop sharing presentation, and we will go to our wonderful panel discussion, which I'm hoping to be very stimulating and interesting and reflecting the experience in the region, because Fernando told us that actually OACS and Caribbean in general have inspired a lot of countries into dealing with the fiscal rules during COVID. So that was very interesting to hear. So let me go with the panel. I've introduced our panelists before, but let me do it again, and maybe they can briefly turn on their cameras as I do it. We have Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Finance, Grenada, Mike Sylvester. Hello, Mike. Thank you for joining us. One of the pioneers of fiscal rules, and we'll talk more about that. We have Governor Antoine from the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, which also has lots of experience with regional promotion of the fiscal rules and other rules and coordination within the region. We have Dr. Christine Clark from University of West Indies, who has written extensively on the economics and Caribbean and the very many issues, including the reforms that we are trying to talk about today. And we have our friend from across the street in Washington from the IMF. We have Huy Dan Lin, who is the mission chief for the IMF for the Caribbean. So now the way we will do it is I have first round of questions, and I'll go to each one of you, and we'll take those questions. We will be monitoring the questions that are coming to us, and we will be taking those as they come in. But I'll start with the first round. I will go first to PS Sylvester. We heard even from Fernando's presentation about Caribbean has been a bit of a pioneer in establishing some of these fiscal rules, and Grenada has had established a fiscal rule a while ago and have also used it over the period of time. So I was wondering if you could just bring a little bit of your perspective of why did Grenada choose to adopt this rule? How, any reflections on the experience in Grenada, but also maybe reflect a little bit on this issue of how did you envisage to deal with the natural disasters as you were putting these fiscal rules in place, if things changed over time. Basically, tell us why did you do it and how did it work for you in Grenada? Thank you. Over to you, PS Sylvester. Thank you. I'm muted. Yes, we cannot hear you for some reason.
Are you hearing me?
Yeah, now loud and clear. Perfect. Thank you.
I'm trying to fix this issue. So Natalia, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Of course, good afternoon to the other distinguished panelists and to those who are listening and viewing this important program. Let me at the outset, thank the World Bank for launching this very important series of educational webinars for the Caribbean addressing fiscal policy to build a resilient in small countries. In terms of Grenada's experience in respect of motivation, what I will say on that, it was really a wake-up call for Grenada. And I say this in the context that as Milton Friedman, the great American economist, said, a crisis, real or perceived, produces real change. And I think there was a recognition in Grenada, in particular, that there was a need for change. You can't continue doing the same thing over and over and expect different results. And so I think at the country level, there was this recognition that we needed to do something different. And so the fiscal rules, as part of a suite of legislation during the period of our homegrown structural adjustment program in 2013, that's when it was launched. For the period 2014 to 2016, we launched a homegrown structural adjustment program with our partners, including the IMF, the Fund, the Caribbean Development Bank, and others, And part of that suite of legislation or that reform was the whole issue of fiscal responsibility legislation. And I think I believe the legislation at the time was really how we could do things different, how we can restore fiscal and debt sustainability, and how we can avoid some of these boom and bust, some of the shocks that we were facing over the period dating back from since 2004, starting with Hurricane Ida, several shocks buffeting the island, and of course there are significant consequences arising out of the shocks. So the idea was to really try to address this thing, to do it differently. And in that context, we were able to implement the fiscal rules. In terms of what our experience with fiscal rules, I must say that it has, in fact, been quite positive for us. We've had a significant or marked improvement in our public finances, to the extent that we have accumulated relatively significant buffers. And that was important in the context of the recent pandemic and how we were able to deal with the pandemic. In fact, I think given the fact that the country had some fiscal space, it was able to address the pandemic with some degree of equanimity. And then, of course, it allowed for the whole issue of increasing fiscal transparency. This was one of the issues that we had. And within the context of that, it sort of provided more confidence, in my view, for not just government finances and its ability for government to manage its finances, but also for the private sector and other players in the economy in terms of the fiscal transparency. We had an important element of the legislation, and that has to do with the Fiscal Responsibility Oversight Committee. I think in some countries it's referred to as the Fiscal Council. And that added a level of transparency to government fiscal operations, in the sense that, the FROC usually provide a report on the compliance with the fiscal rules, and that is tabled in Parliament and, of course, discussed at various levels. So I think within the context of that, we were able to strengthen our fiscal framework quite significantly. With respect to the pandemic, and then you mentioned the whole issue of the escape clause. So our fiscal rules include escape clause, and what it allowed us to do within the context of the pandemic was basically to invoke those clauses. And we have invoked the clauses for 3 consecutive years in a row. And this year we returned to the fiscal rules. So I think that shows a level of credibility, a level of fiscal discipline at the level of government and at the country level as well. And so in that context, I want to stop here. But just to add, though, that we are in the process of looking to strengthen that framework, and so we're looking to, of course, the fund and the bank to be able to help us in moving that process forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, P.S. Sylvester. This is really, I think, helpful to understand how you see it from the country perspective and working in it. And I think it will be interesting later when we go to Huidan to see sort of how does it look from the partners' perspective at the IMF. But before we go there, and also regional elements with Governor later. But before we go there, let me first go to Jamaica, to Dr. Clark. Jamaica have also been actively using responsible fiscal policies. It has demonstrated quite substantial achievements, 7 years of fiscal surpluses, major reduction in debt to GDP, some of the more remarkable reform progresses. Could you perhaps reflect on some of that experience? And as you discuss it, if you maybe could sort of reflect also on the role of this kind of auxiliary or support institution around it, if you wish, which is the Fiscal Responsibility Law, the oversight mechanism of the Fiscal Council, and the medium-term fiscal framework. What role do those other institutional elements play in the implementation of the fiscal rules? Over to you, Dr. Clark. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Natalia, and thanks to yourself and the organizers for inviting me to share a bit of what my research would have shown in relation to these issues. So one thing to note is that the Jamaican experience is one that was hard fought, hard won over quite a few years. We're going almost over a decade now. And it started with, of course, the 2006-7 food price crisis up through to the financial and economic crisis. We had local domestic issues that also, inserted themselves. But 3 consecutive fund agreements, in essence, that were themselves very hard to convince the population to engage with, and that we were able to use and transform to develop, in essence, our own governance framework that was driven, in essence, by the Economic Program Oversight Committee. There were social partnerships that attempted to, in essence, convey to a wide cross-section all the sectoral elements, a national education program as to why it was we needed to have fiscal consolidation, fiscal discipline. So that is where we started with the essence, cleaning up our public enterprises, our public bodies. We had entities that were driving significant contingent liabilities that had to be addressed before we were even able to think about fiscal rules. There was budgetary control, ensuring that the budget covered every single entity in the public sector. That did not happen before 2007. And so a fiscal rule would not have helped address the issues if you were not having oversight of every single thing that was being done. The Minister of Finance and his responsibilities, his powers, his accountability, what he has to commit to, all of those things had to be worked out in relation to other ministers who, prior to that, those 3 agreements, were able to incur debt that was not accounted for in terms of the budget. So there are a lot of institutional developments that had to happen, decisions about how we were going to operate, why we had to change how we were operating, and the mechanisms to, in essence, build transparency, ultimately towards the goal of building credibility. The Fiscal Council is kind of like, what is rounding off this kind of whole umbrella, if you want to call it, or layers of what we had to go through. Because as you know, the commissioner, the inaugural commissioner, has just been appointed. And so that in and of itself will require institutional development, from human resources all the way up to ensure that it can in fact deliver on what it is intended to do in terms of that independence, oversight that is separate and apart. We have an auditor general who does go in through her office to look at various activities, including most notably the COVID-19 response, which incidentally was also some people would say part paid off by, having done all of this effort on the fiscal side. Our independence of the central bank actually generated a windfall. Luckily that was able to help to pay for some of the very COVID-19 responses, the buffers and everything that was put in place. So in a way, you're seeing, a decade-long set of efforts over multiple governments, multiple ministers of finance, different prime ministers, because we had to build that consensus. So there are many levels to what we were able to accomplish and achieve, and therefore, I would say, it ties in with the last slide that was shown, that it's not just that you put in a fiscal rule and then you get the benefits. You really have to put everything on the table, on the fiscal side, the monetary side, and literally, kind of check the boxes as you go along in the reform. Think about the sequencing, the political realities, the political economy needs, because yes, as fiscal experts, we know maybe the technical answers, but none of us can go to Parliament and implement them. It has to go through this political process that is very important to the whole structure of the society, how the society will gel together and hang. And I think many of you would have heard about, as I indicated, the EPOC, our governance system that was in essence run by the private sector, who were holding the government to account frequently in terms of press briefings, press releases, commenting on the pace of the reform, whether we will indeed meet, whatever IMF targets were ahead. So it is a welcome thing to see that we're at the point where we can have this fiscal commission, but it could not have happened, in just kind of one fell swoop. And so I hope I have encapsulated, in essence, the road that Jamaica has had to go through in order to be here.
No, thank you. I think indeed, it's a decade process and longer. And to some extent, this is really a social contract because it goes to some key political agreements that have to happen and consensus that has to emerge within the country. And I think that's a very valid point to emphasize that it's not just the rule. And Fernando also was making it. You don't just put rule on the paper and it's just an equation and just some little accounting thing. There is a political process there as well. Actually, while we're on this point, why don't I go to Governor Antoine, and then Huidan, I'll get to you afterwards. But Governor, I think after listening to Grenada and to Jamaica, it would be also interesting to hear from your perspective, the rule about the 60% debt to GDP rule have been adopted in 98 for the CCB countries, but then there's been lots of changes. It would be interesting to hear this kind of regional element to it that you see. And also while you are reflecting on that, I'll add a question, risk to add a question that we are getting from the audience, which is saying, what are the key impediments to implementing fiscal rules? So if you may be reflecting on what you see from the different countries and the regional kind of coordination and discussion on this, also perhaps reflecting on what do you believe is like key challenge that countries seen, and perhaps like either putting in place fiscal rules or implementing them or sticking to them? Over to you.
Thank you, Natalia, and greetings to my fellow panelists, and thank you to the World Bank for setting this up and shining a light on what is a very important issue for our region. At the outset, I want to be clear. I mean, we live in a shock-prone world, and in this region, we are extremely vulnerable to shocks. As I say to our countries all the time, the shocks keep coming. And I say that to say that is a backdrop for why resilience is so important for this region. And for me, resilience is the capacity to absorb, withstand shocks, and to bounce forward, not back, forward, because every shock should be leveraged. The legacy of every shock should mean that the country is put in a better position than before the shock. But you have to be positioned so to do. And that is why at the outset of this discussion, certainly I want to reframe this term called fiscal rules to talk about fiscal resilience frameworks. Fiscal resilience framework, because I'm coming to the question of why there are impediments to fiscal resilience in this region, a region that needs it so desperately. And the reason why I reframe it that way is because of my experience as a practitioner in my former life as financial secretary in Grenada, and now as an advocate in my role at the central bank. I find fiscal resilience framework a more engaging and a more empowering concept. Engaging because it improves the dialogue. Language matters, always has, always will. So you move the discussion from talking about restriction and discipline to talking about flexibility and freedom. Every finance minister, every country wants to have the ability to spend more money when there's a shock, to cushion the effect on the population by pursuing counter-cyclical fiscal policy. And frankly spoken, that has to be the development outcome. So when I articulate the term fiscal resilience framework, what I'm in fact doing is at the outset being very transparent about what is the development outcome. Why are we doing this? So it is transparent, but it's also empowering, because I am saying to the country, the finance minister, you need to have the tools, Minister of Finance, to be able to deliver counter-cyclical policy. If you don't, then the shock is magnified, the recovery is retarded, and the pain is prolonged. And Mike will tell you, my colleague Pierre Sylvester will tell you, in Grenada during the Great Recession between 2008 to 2012, there were people saying, why is the government not spending more money to get us out of this in the shortest possible time? And the pundits and those who think they know Well, it's a simple case. The government needs to spend to get us out of this. What they seem to have not have missed, or what escaped them, is the fact that there was no fiscal space and that the country was maxed out when it comes to debt. So it's all well and good to sit down in your armchair and say, spend more money. From where? Funded by whom? That is the power of counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So I want to be very clear. But it is also important with the dialogue, because of the question about the impediment, there are politicians and governments who see fiscal rules as handcuffs on their ability to deliver on their mandates. That's a fact. There are unions who see fiscal rules as hindering their ability to negotiate contracts for their workers. We have to reframe this in this region. If we reframe it to be talking about fiscal resilience, everybody gets that, because as Pierre Sylvester said, Grenada was better off during the pandemic, difficult as it was, because it had some fiscal space, because the government could pursue counter-cyclical fiscal policy. That's the proof. That's the proof. So it's not telling them, you have to show them. That is the proof of the decision that was made in Grenada to implement the fiscal responsibility law in 2015. So for me, that reframing in this region is important. And like I said, when we frame it in that way, the concept becomes both engaging and empowering. Even the notion of escape clause, I agree, we need an escape clause. We saw it again in Grenada, to use that example recently. But really and truly, as one prime minister said to me, what happened? Am I in jail and I need an escape clause? Really and truly, the escape clause is a shock response. That's what it is, a shock response clause that allows the country to respond to a shock with defined parameters, as Fernando indicated. So I think that reframing is important for this region, and I think it would help us to move the dialogue along and to break down some of the barriers around this framework. Finally, because you asked me about the regional scope, I will simply say, by the way, the 60% debt to GDP ratio is a target. It is not a rule, because it is not binding on any country. Fiscal resilience frameworks must have the power of law, such as you have in Grenada, such as you have in Anguilla, such as you have in Jamaica and Barbados. It must have the power of law. So what the Monetary Council did at the level of the central bank, ECCB, it was to create a target, a debt target. I don't want to say debt rule because it is not binding. It has to go, unless it has the power of law in a parliament, it isn't. Having said that, I will end by saying, in terms of the role for our central bank, I see a role for us in advocacy, such as we do now, and as that I continue to do, we continue to do as I move around the currency union. I see a role for us to participate in these fiscal councils. So Pierre Sylvester will tell you, for example, in the case of Grenada's Fiscal Resilience Oversight Framework, Fiscal Responsibility Oversight Committee, as it is called, we ECCB has a nominee. The law requires the central bank governor to name a nominee to the parliament. And we obviously have embraced that opportunity, and we have a nominee. That's one way for us to contribute directly. Technical assistance. Right now, the IMF is working with Grenada on the revision, technical assistance. Sharing experiences, what has worked and what hasn't worked. And again, Grenada has some rich experiences to share. Now Jamaica, soon Barbados, and others. So I think there's a regional role for us to bring people together, to share those experiences, to learn from each other, and to encourage each other to do what we need to do for the sake of resilience. And I will pause there in the interest of time.
Oh, thank you, Governor. And I think, yeah, this is a very, very valid point, especially in the context of what we were just talking with Christine before about the social contract. And this is not an accounting idea. This is a much broader issue, and words matter. And not just that words matter. I mean, I think often these things, it's maybe not enough thoughts goes into that broader process. But when people, I know the fiscal economists who design all these rules, the objective, of course, is to improve resilience. is to create fiscal space, is to enable successive administrations to improve consistency of implementation of the fiscal measures and create room for the economy to develop sustainably. So I think the aspiration is there, but it just doesn't really come through in these words maybe that we use. And yeah,
so Natalia, just to be clear, I know the next panelist must go. It is not a technical issue. It starts there. It's a political decision.
Correct.
That's why you can't use technical language to engage people, governments, unions. The people have to own it. It is a political decision. And I think that's a mistake we've made sometimes, where we make it overly technical. That's not a debate among economists. We all agree among economists we need to do this. It's a political issue. Let me stop there because the next panelist must come.
No worries. No, thank you. No, and thank you for bringing that home as well. So we need to be always mindful of that part of it. Now, Lynn, Huidan, over to you. And like the question, the way I would like to frame it as our discussion evolves is when we talk about the fiscal resilience and the shock response clauses, formerly known as escape clauses, both Jamaica and Grenada had fiscal rules. They both, during COVID, stepped away. They, unlike some others, they have introduced back on and they're pursuing their policies. Now, could you give us perspective from the IMF, just from these cases, but also broader in terms of the experience of using the shock response clauses? See, we are responding right away. And any kind of views of what worked, what didn't, and thinking for the future. Over to you, Huidan. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, and hello all at the panel and in the audience. And thanks first to the World Bank for having me at this excellent panel and on a very important and timely topic. Indeed, fiscal frameworks were up to test during the pandemic, and IMF staff analysis noted that over 30 countries actually used the shock response mechanism to make space for the needed fiscal intervention. The unprecedented fiscal actions have actually led to large deviations from deficit and debt limit. But experience shows that these deviations from that limit have been very difficult to reverse. We are still facing a lot of risks, but as the recovery takes hold in the region, now is a prime time for us to all brainstorm on how to get back to the debt path. As a close observer of the Grenadian economics and policy development over the past 2 years, I would like to offer 2 areas that I've learned from the Grenadian case. As also mentioned by P.S. Sylvester, prudent fiscal management in the past have helped reduce public debt and build up buffers for the Grenadian government to use in rainy days. The shock response mechanism allowed the government to use these buffers in response to the pandemic and later the rise in energy and food prices. As a result, although the public debts increased significantly during the pandemic, it was able to return to a downward path in just 2 years' time. So here, a good lesson learned is the following. It is paramount to have an institutional framework that focuses on debt reduction, but also allows for deviations to deal with large shocks. However, in face of economic shocks as big as this time and a deviation of debt path as wide as this time, it has been difficult to find an answer from the existing framework to some practical questions. For instance, how fast the debt should be going back on track. There's a balance to strike between the urgency of debt reduction and the feasibility of required fiscal effort. For example, fiscal adjustment needs to be very careful not to hamper the nascent recovery from the shocks, but can become more aggressive as output moves to the potential. Therefore, the lesson here is that the framework does need improvements to provide a clearer guidance for fiscal management to bounce back forward to a better future after these shocks, as the governor rightly put it. So how to ensure it? In my view, 3 areas can be considered for the Grenada case, but I would like to note upfront that a desirable combination of various requirements should really consider country-specific characteristics. So the 3 areas I'm going to offer to mention below will have to have a good trade-off and balance in each individual country case. First, a more effective medium-term fiscal framework. The work on the medium-term fiscal framework can be brought forward in the budget cycle to play a more central role in framing and guiding the fiscal plans. For example, it should set a primary balance floor for all the years covered, consistent with getting the debt path back on track. And the medium-term plan can lay out the multiple year revenue projections and required expenditure ceilings to meet the debt reduction goal. Second, the government's accountability can be reinforced, including under a comply or explain provision in the law. For example, the finance minister should continue to be required by the law to be accountable for meeting the debt reduction angle. In the case of non-meeting in a particular year, written responses should be provided to the parliament, and new measures on revenue or expenditure should be identified for the next fiscal framework. Third, the role of the fiscal council can be elevated. For example, it should validate the macro assumptions underpinning the government's recovery plan, and the government should in turn facilitate the sharing of the information timely. And this council's accountability to the public and the parliament can be enhanced through more regular communication from the council to the public, and also have regular hearings at the parliament. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Huidan. No, this is a really good summary, I think, of these issues that come up, but also kind of reflecting and summarizing in terms of what we can take away from this very traumatic COVID crisis years. In this region, natural disasters have been kind of a practice ground, but also it doesn't look like the world is becoming a more stable place, to be honest, and we observe all kinds of new shocks. And so sort of taking on board some of those learnings and systematically thinking about these institutions, I think it's really helpful that the fund is looking at these issues and bringing them together like that. Now, we are getting some interesting questions from the audience, so I'm going to kind of bundle them and then go to each one of you. And I think with our time, that will pretty much use up the rest of our conversation. So, So one, it relates, I think, to what we've already been talking about, but I would like to go to Pierre Sylvester first, then to Christine, then Governor Antoine, then Huidan and Fernando. And the question is the following: how does fiscal rules affect public sector development? Basically, how does it affect the economy? And how much input citizens have in the implementation? I think it goes to this issue we were talking about, that the fiscal rule is not just some obscure hidden number that it has no meaning anywhere beyond, but it's something that is at the core of overall kind of economic planning. And ultimately then, how do people and citizens kind of bear on implementation of these commitments by the government elected by the people? So that's one kind of element of it. And another one is more specific: is there debt to GDP threshold in the Caribbean that countries can use as benchmark to know when debt becomes unsustainable? If yes, what is this threshold? Now, we can maybe ask Fernando and Huidan reflect on that one. The magic number, with all we know is that there is no magic number. that one thing we've learned, but maybe there is, so we will hear from them about that. But let me first go with that first question about fiscal rule, how it fits with broader economic thinking, and how can citizens engage in this process? Maybe, can I go to Pierre Sylvester first? Is that good, Mike? Cannot hear. No, still cannot hear. Wait. No. The Piers is muted.
Are you hearing me?
Yes. Yep, now loud and clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting question. So I think one of the benefits of the rule is that it embeds fiscal discipline in the budget preparation and execution process as well. And part of the budget preparation and execution process is the whole issue of consultations with the citizenry. So we in preparing the budget, for example, we engage the citizens in terms of what the government's broad economic framework is within the context of the fiscal rules. So whether it's in our case the debt anchor, whether it's the primary balance, the wage bill, and so on, we engage the citizen in that, and in some cases more focused group discussions. So for example, the unions, when we have the negotiations, part of the discussion surrounds the whole issue of the wage bill threshold. So we have a 9% of GDP threshold on the wage bill, and so that becomes part and parcel of the conversation that we have. So within that context, the citizens they are aware of what the rules are within the context of the law, and what the government is trying to do in terms of ensuring that we not only maintain fiscal discipline, but as well that the government is in a position to be able to achieve its mandate and achieve its objectives and goals and so on for that particular budget year and the medium-term framework.
Thank you. Yeah, that's, I mean, the whole budget process, and yeah, having observed now, I've been about a year in the Caribbean, and having observed the lively debates surrounding budgets all across the region, this is a very, very material point you're making. Now, over to you, Dr. Clark. I mean, also, it's been about a year that I'm in Jamaica, and coming from outside of the region, I must say it's really impressive how much Minister of Finance kind of reflects and talks about fiscal policy and the 60% debt to GDP. And it's not very often that to be honest, you hear politicians talking about something which is this kind of straight jacket. Yes. But maybe some reflections from you, because you've studied this for much longer, obviously, than I had the chance to observe over.
Sure. As I said, you know, what we had to do is change, in essence, the mindset, right? So I agree with what Governor Antoine had mentioned in relation to it was seen previously as, you know, these things are straitjackets there. But when you transform the ministry and the minister's mind to viewing this as actually his or her protection, right? You are now responsible. So it starts from fiscal responsibility, not the rules. You are responsible to affirm to the nation, not even just to the cabinet or the parliament, to the nation, that this budget in all its entirety is credible. It can be achieved given everything, including potential shocks, and that you then put it back on your minister colleagues and MPs to say, okay, you want to change, you want to do something more, go back and reprioritize your previously submitted list. And that then forces each minister, each PS, each ministry, each department and agency to go back and say, okay, we want to do this, but then we had this other slate already. How is it going to gel? So the reprioritization in one aspect, you know, from the technical level goes back down, you know, back down to the stakeholders who were agitating for the previous list. Should we change? Should we adopt? Or should we say, no, we leave that, you know, to the next period? And then, as I said, you know, through our adjustment process beginning in 2010, we recognized the need to engage. So the social partnership was one aspect, as I said, all sectors, every single one, barring none, including trade unions, bankers, everybody, civil society groups of various kinds, including the National Integrity Commission. So the eyesights were on, and each entity, yes, there were agreements to not release certain information to the public, but each was able to communicate to their own stakeholders back and forth to the social partnership. At one point, that was chaired by a minister, and then after that, the prime minister actually took over the running of the chairing of the meetings and the engagement of the parties to demonstrate. And then once the fund program got underway, as I indicated, we had the Economic Program Oversight Committee, which was just another dimension of the private sector engagement. And I don't know, you've been in Jamaica, so I don't know if you've had the benefit of listening to talk shows that are on the radio, and it's the same callers, but the issues are raised there over and over again, focusing on this is what we have to do, the pushback. So the population coverage was actually, I think, if you add it all up, quite remarkable. And then the members of parliament, apologies, they also have interface through our constituency development fund and other things at the local level to say, okay, what are the priorities here? So there are angles. I couldn't say, every single person had a say, but certainly the publication of the information, the ability of people to interact, to push back and say, nonsense, what is this? And then that discussion happens, existed. I mean, there was an environment where, is this really what we have to go through at one point, the bitter medicine kind of thing? But then now, as I indicated, we see where the benefits lie. Yes, it's still difficult. Yes, we always want to spend, but okay, the Minister of Finance can now say, oh, you want to? No problem. Revise what you had previously submitted, keeping the bottom line the same, and show me how it connects also with Vision 2030, which is our National Development Plan. Make sure it's aligned to all of these things, the SDGs. So you will see in the budget, you actually go through, we call it the big yellow book. If you go through, each project has to indicate how it's aligned, what is it trying to accomplish, not just a kind of wish list. Let's just do all of these quote unquote nice things. So I think there was certainly in the last decade more opportunities. It may not have been perfect. There could have been perhaps more participatory aspects, but certainly it's a far improvement, I think, from where we would have been had we not tried to do these new governance type approaches.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, and it's I think it's a fascinating case, Jamaica. But of course, in all of the Caribbean countries, there is very interesting experience. But I think the kind of the participation and the groundswell, if you wish, around this have been really something that you do not often get to observe. Now, let me turn to Governor Antoine. We already touched on some of it. I don't know if you want to add anything to your earlier remarks. Feel free on the debt sustainability question, which is a whole different separate topic. But if you have any reflection maybe on the target and why 60% was chosen, if that's or not, or just any sort of reflection on this kind of broader questions about how the resilience frameworks and shock responses clauses fit with the kind of broader developmental process and how to engage citizens more effectively, probably. Over.
Well, two issues. I mean, I think it's just to help manage the variability in the growth trajectory, growth performance. I mean, this year is 40 years for our central bank. And as I indicated some months ago when we launched our celebrations for 40th anniversary, you look at the performance of the currency in over 40 years. We've had some great years. We've had some really poor years or, significant contraction. Overall, the growth performance is disappointing. And the reality is that had we had fiscal space to better manage those shocks, then we would have less variability in the economic outturns in the cycle. There will be ups and downs. That's the nature of the economic cycle, but you want to minimize, smooth out as far as it's possible. That is important. That's a tool that every country wants to have, every finance minister wants to have at his or her disposal. So that's an argument for fiscal resilience frameworks. Very quickly, I see in the chat a question about the benchmark. So typically, because of international sort of standards, 60% is a benchmark that we have embraced. And that's what you alluded to earlier in the currency union. And many countries across the region target 60%. But here's the thing, there is a school of thought, an argument, which I have sympathy for, that perhaps as small states, we need to be targeting 40%, not 60. And I know that's very controversial, and you'll get a lot of pushback from governments on that issue. But the reality is that you want to have the space to be able to respond to a shock. So I'll give you an example. In the currency union, when the pandemic hit, overall we were at 65% debt to GDP ratio. When the pandemic hit, 1 year, a shock of 16% in terms of a contraction, and with debt borrowing, that skyrocketed to 87%. 1 year.
In one year.
Shock.
Yeah.
One
No,
shock.
this is just
One shock. So after working for many, many years to get to 60, chipping away, we were in the 70s, 80s, 70s, we come down, we're at 65. We see in the finishing lines in sight. St. Kitts has met it, Grenada has, and then we get a shock. Everybody else goes back over 60. And now the average is from 65 to 87. And it feels like we're starting over again. So now we're down to about 70 something, 73, thereabouts. The point is that you have to have that space. 40% would have allowed us to then get to 60, 62, if you see my point, a simple argument. And then we could work our way back. So 60 is probably still too high, but if you're at 80 or 90 or 100, 60 is a good place to target. So I don't want to discourage those who are way over and who are working to 60. But I have sympathy in these small states, which are so shock prone and which are so tourism dependent, that perhaps 60 is even too high. In the Grenada law, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was 55% that was targeted in Grenada's law, because even then, back in 2015, Grenada saw the need to be under 60. You need to have some room. Whether 5% is enough, we could debate that. Maybe it should be 50, with a 10% room to operate a shock response. But I certainly think we have to be looking at that. And by the way, let me just end by saying, as I said to Dr. Clark recently in Washington, I commend Jamaica on where you are now. I remember the days when Jamaica was well over 130. And you worked your way, you worked your way, and you're coming down. And that is highly commendable. And it's why, as Christine said, you need a national effort. As Dr. Clark indicated, you need a national, everybody has to buy in, not just the government, to make this work. They have to see it is in there and hold the politicians, the governments accountable. So that not just the governments understand the necessity, but the people understand the necessity and will not allow governments to simply blow up the targets, ignore them, do whatever they want, and then when the time comes when they need them to respond, they have no capacity so to do. That's a very important issue for our region and for building resilience. Let me stop there.
Oh, thank you. No, and that's, yeah, I think bring it home very clearly, you know, the scale of the challenge and what it takes to deal with it. Now, we only have 5 minutes left. So I want very briefly to go to Huitan and Fernando, but very briefly, because this is a hard cut off with 2 questions. One is on the target, like literally in 1 or 2 sentences, if there is a view on that or not. And another one is any reflection on the citizen engagement, especially Fernando, you know, to what extent countries have been effective or not? Is this the area to go, like to do more on bringing people on board with this kind of issues? Over, Huidan, to you first.
Okay, thank you, Natalia. Perhaps I will pick up on the debt threshold question. Yes, we need to put a numeric debt anchor or target in the law to, that is something the government should work towards, but this level should not be, this is a target. This should be a carefully designed as a safe level that ensures that will still remain sustainable, even if similarly negative shocks were to happen in the future. It is still safe, but it is a practical question and country-specific question to answer, like exactly what the number it should be it 60 or 55, or what Governor said that even 40. To me, there are 3 areas to consider. First is the policymakers' risk tolerance. The second is the magnitude of the future macro and fiscal shocks. And third, the probability and frequency of the shocks. So lower risk tolerance and larger shocks and more frequent shocks, for instance, some natural disasters would justify a larger safety margin, hence a lower dead anchor. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Okay, we have a hard stop, but Fernando, can you, especially on the citizen side,
Yes.
what is the bottom line? Thank you.
Here, Natalia, it's true. No, I was mentioning that it's a social contract. That the fiscal rule at the end is a social contract. That you need the population engaged, and the population and the political system needs to endorse to the rule. This is a basic issue that you need to address when you decide for a fiscal rule. Fiscal councils are very important, not only because it forces you or has enforcement mechanisms or try to oversight what the government is doing, but just to make public the discussion on fiscal policy. I think that this is other role that is important for fiscal council. All the discussions, all the policy options. I want to spend more on pensions. I want to spend more on health. Okay, but these are the fiscal consequences of that. And I think that the informative role of fiscal council is very, very important to share with the society what are the options and put numbers to these options. Everybody wants everything, but you need to say, okay, this is the fiscal impact of that. And I found that in several countries, fiscal council, they play this role. That for me is even more important than oversight the government or discuss with the government all the technical issues, is to make broader the discussion of fiscal policy options. And I think that this is the way to strengthen the fiscal role with support of the society.
Thank you so much, Fernando. And thank you so much, all of our panelists and presenters. I think we had a really good discussion. We keep having questions rolling in. Some of them are really interesting questions I wish we could discuss, but we're out of time for today. We really want to continue this conversation and tackle all of these important issues. And let me again use the language that I think we agreed about today, which is the fiscal resilience frameworks. And we are talking about shock response clauses and solutions, which Caribbean will inspire the new generation of solutions for the resilience fiscal frameworks, I think. Thank you so much, dear panelists, and thank you so much for everybody who was connected. I'm reminded that we have 2 more webinars on this topic coming up. So stay tuned, follow us, watch our seminars, and keep sending questions, and we will make sure that we focus our future presentations and discussions on those. Thank you so much, everyone, and thanks for connecting, and till the next time. Thanks. Bye.